to talk a little bit about sort of parallel discussions on the Gospels, and to kind of see what kind of parts that we get out of looking at at the Gospels. And remember, anytime we do this, we're really kind of looking at the text and trying to see what the author is trying to tell us, and trying to give us insight as we do this. This is certainly a very structural approach. It may be something that it just takes some time and practice to get comfortable with. And if you happen to be, someone who is in a faith in this, the point of doing this is never to be destroying faith. Although if you're one of not of faith, the point is not to create faith or not to destroy it or anything. The point is, let's look structurally at what's going on, and then from that we can begin to then talk about what we're seeing as a result of this. Because the text is definitely trying to tell a story, and we want to see the complete story here. Now, an interesting thing as we look at both Matthew and Luke, right off the bat, if you look at Matthew's story, if you look at the pieces of it, and we're going to talk about the birth narratives, and we're going to sort of go through the first couple chapters. And that's going to start off with, in Matthew, it goes from sort of the genealogy, which has spent a lot of time going from Abraham to Jesus. Then we see the discussion of Joseph. Joseph accepting that Jesus will, there and not, sending Mary away and so forth. Interestingly enough, the story often talks about living near Jerusalem, which is kind of an interesting perspective. You talk about Jesus' birth story, and that has a lot to do with Magi, Herod being very disturbed that maybe a king is being born, and being told this by the Magi, and Jesus' birth, and as a result, Herod just wiping out the children, that the family escaped to Egypt, that they returned, but they didn't return to Jerusalem, but to Nazareth, because there were still some concerns. And then basically after that shows up as John the Baptist, and which includes Jesus' baptism. So really, a very clear story. It definitely gives you the sense of this from Joseph's perspective, gives you the perspective of, what's going on in terms of kings and powers and so forth, and sort of framing this within a Jewish perspective. You might even argue that Jesus also had to go down to Egypt and come back up to Egypt. That allusion certainly is meaningful in some cases. But take a look at the conversation in Luke. And it's interesting because there are parts of the Matthew narrative we think of, and there are parts of the Luke narrative we think of, but they actually are two different sets of stories. Now, could they be consistent? Maybe, but they're different, and it is important to be paying attention to that. In Luke, we find that we definitely get the story of Zachariah and Elizabeth, where you certainly see the story of Zachariah and the angel in the temple, and Zachariah can't speak for a while until after the child is born. We see Mary and the angel, so it's Mary's discussion with the angel in Nazareth. We see Mary and Elizabeth. We see Mary's song, the Magnificat, which tends to be a very, 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 very strong worded structure of, the rulers and the powers of this world will now be destroyed. It's a very revolutionary sort of sense, and you see this throughout all of Luke, but it starts very early. You see the birth of John the Baptist. You see Zachariah's song to this. You see the birth of Jesus in Luke 2, 1 through 7, and the shepherds and Jesus. Now, this is part of Luke is always the narrative that we typically hear at Christmas for those who are of Christian faith, and we'll hear this a lot. This is like the very familiar story. But notice this comes out of Luke's discussion. I know that. And then, of course, a little bit afterwards, you have Luke talking about Mary and Joseph presenting Jesus at the temple. There have been holy people at the temple who recognize. You then see them coming back to the temple with Jesus at 12 years old. And then you see John the Baptist and Jesus' baptism. And then after that, you get the genealogy of Jesus pointing to Adam. Very interesting stories, and very interesting to see these things put side by side, because these are two different stories. They're two different narratives of potentially the same story, or at least potentially the story of what Matthew knew and what Luke knew, and then bringing the stories together. Now, interestingly enough, you could have a fused story, and in fact, fused stories did exist even in the 2nd century. They did not make it into the canon, which I find that intriguing, because what it seems to say is we understand that there are some interesting aspects and differences, and we understand that this is complicated, and so much like a good mathematician, you would want multiple perspectives that you can kind of build a more higher dimensional perspective of the world, or of the system you're looking at. Much here, it seems like this actually gives us much greater depth and perspective over what might be happening, and for us to be able to see this from two people's perspective and get depth as a result.